Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Under the Macroscope, Skybound Capital's weekly podcast. And for the second consecutive week, the roles are being reversed. Last week, it was research analyst Josie Davis who was playing the interviewer role, and I stepped into interviewee. And now we revert, and we're doing so for very good reason. It is Women's Month in South Africa, the month of August. And the team at Skybound has been focusing in on a number of issues relating specifically to women in the workplace. And Josie has recently produced an outstanding presentation on the impact of women in the workplace and some of the challenges being faced. And Josie, perhaps we could start with what we term the global gender gap. Some statistics around it, why the gap exists and why it's so important to close this gender gap.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, so there is a huge gender gap worldwide. Women are significantly disadvantaged in terms of laws and restrictions that they're subject to in some jurisdictions, as well as in the workplace where they often are marginalized and are less likely to get promoted. Just around the world, to give some statistics to highlight this gender gap. There are 72 countries in the world where women are barred from opening bank accounts or obtaining credit. And there are also 3.2 million women worldwide that are legally restricted from having the same job choices as men.
And so there are some massive macro issues to address across entire economies and workplaces. Can we zero in on executive roles as well? Because you've focused in on this where some of this inequality is most keenly felt.
Yeah, so men significantly outnumber women in senior executive roles in most companies around the world. I mean, if we take a look at the Fortune Global 500 companies, women only represent 4.6% of CEOs in these companies. Although it has increased in the recent years, we're still very far away from achieving any semblance of gender balance in these top roles. And this statistic remains quite constant across different samples as well. If we take the S&P 500, only, I think, 5.9% of women in these companies are CEOs. And even where women make up a significant portion of the workforce, so again, to take the S&P 500, women represent nearly 45% of the total employees. But then again, as you move up the ranks into more senior positions, their representation significantly declines. So that's a problem with promoting women to these top positions where they can affect change from a more prominent perch.
Yeah, so much work to be done at an executive level based on those unambiguous statistics that you shared. But how important is it also to focus on the type of role being played by women and not just zero in on the seniority of the role?
Yeah, so actually there's a lot of statistics on the percentage of women that make up things like boards of companies and executive committees, which sound very impressive. So to take the financial industry, I mean, they're making a lot of progress in terms of women representation at executive committee and board level. But a lot of these roles are occupied by women on non-executive roles where they don't have power to make profit and loss altering decisions. So if a lot of the women in these roles represent things like human resources and legal and marketing, which is really great, but you have to look at the influence that they will have on major decisions of the company. So, and not just to look at the seniority, but also, yes, as you said, the type of role.
And Josie, what about the power of role models in this regard?
Yeah, so I was really surprised by one statistic that I found, which was that girls that have a mother in a STEM field, STEM is science, technology, engineering, or maths, which includes finance, which is the industry we're in, are 46% more likely to go for a career in that same sector than boys. So I think just like having someone that you can look up to that is in that career or in a high role really influences someone's perception of where they can get. So I think that promoting talented women into these roles is extremely important to encourage more girls to enter the industry from a young age.
And what you've said so far, I mean, the gap is real. It is a gaping gap. What, in your opinion, on the positive side, is being done to close it?
I mean, I think that the key to this is awareness. So I think that discussions like this being had across the industry and like in companies is very important to eliminate the subconscious biases that exist. So people being aware that they may favor males over females in promoting is really important. So if you have two people with equivalent qualifications and equivalent potential, maybe saying that you would rather promote the woman to try and close that gap, because I mean, women are more likely to hire more women as men are likely to hire more men, but at the moment there's more men in those top positions. So putting women in those positions also will kind of over time try and even out the industry-wide gender split.
And I think that there needs to be a mindset shift as well around the acceptance of the power of diversity. I mean, listeners to the podcast last week when you were interviewing me about sport will know that there's great power in diversity in sports teams. And I've spoken about this personally a lot. When you bring a diverse group of people together from different backgrounds, different language groups, starkly different upbringings, if properly harnessed, there is massive strength to be achieved through diversity. And you've found this in your studies that diverse teams tend to outperform.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of research and a lot of studies out there that have shown that diverse teams perform better on like profitability and are also more innovative. And McKinsey actually did a study where they found that more diverse teams, so teams that ranked in the top quartile in diversity, were 25% more likely to have above average profitability than teams in the bottom quartile for diversity, and the same goes for ethnic diversity. So it's really diversity across a lot of different metrics, and actually also the likelihood of outperformance increases with increased diversity. So teams that have 30% diversity are more likely to outperform than teams that have 10% diversity. So really is important. There's a lot of research out there that is showing this and highlighting the importance of it.
Yeah, so there definitely needs to be a willingness to change, and that comes in a big way from attitude towards creating more diverse teams, but regulators can also play a role. I'm interested in a point you raised in your recent presentation around the Nasdaq and the requirements that they have for board members.
Yeah, so I think that regulation will play a huge role and give industries and companies a big push to actually realizing the diversity that is needed. But as you mentioned, the Nasdaq, I think on the 6th of August this year, they announced a rule that requires all companies listed on the Nasdaq to have at least 2 diverse board members. And if they fail to do this, they have to explain why they failed to meet this requirement. And then they also have to report on the diversity of their board. So really increasing the transparency as people are becoming aware that diversity is important, to allow that to become a factor in the decision-making process.
And taking a step back from the Nasdaq to sort of pre-listing days, Josie, let's talk a little bit about VC funding, because there was some pretty disturbing news during 2020. VC funding for women reduced to an all-time low. And perhaps you can reflect on that, and in doing so, just highlight some of the challenges faced by women when trying to raise funding.
Yeah, so I mean, just looking at venture capital funding overall in 2020, it increased by 13% to, I think it was $150 billion was raised, but it wasn't evenly distributed between female-founded startups and male-founded startups. So after reaching an all-time high of raising 2.6% of venture capital funding in 2019, women-led startups only raised 2.2% of funding in 2020. And that statistic has remained relatively constant since 2010, so over the past decade. And a lot of this has to do with this thing called the networking effect. So in venture capital rounds, people tend to stick in their networks, and those networks at the moment tend to be boys' clubs, which are very hard for women as well as people of color to break into. And then when the pandemic came along and face-to-face meetings weren't allowed, it really enhanced that effect, which is why female-led startups raised even less funding. And really this raising of funding happens throughout, kind of from early stage fundraising to late stage, because women are often their business models, because of these subconscious biases, business models are viewed as less fundable. And they also, in these fundraising rounds, face more questions around their competence and ability to scale a business than their actual business models. And then, so women-led startups often have to scale underfunded. So then when they get to late fundraising rounds, they have to answer questions as why did it take them so long to scale? So it really is hard throughout the process, and there needs to be a lot of work that's put in throughout all stages. And then actually they found that when women-led startups are funded, they tend to perform better, and that's because they have to be stronger business models to be funded. So it's a perpetuating cycle, really.
Yeah, and another factor that we can talk about from 2020, we spoke about the reduction in funding over that period and into 2021. Another major factor has been this concept of remote working that we were all forced into, flexible working hours, having to balance work and life challenges during the pandemic. And I guess, without giving too much thought to it, you might have thought that would have been a benefit to many, having that increased flexibility and access to remote working tools. But this has not necessarily been the case for women.
Yeah, so as you said, flexible working was initially seen as a positive, which it can be in some cases. Women are able to spend more time with their children and able to do more household responsibilities. But actually, I mean, if we take the US and the financial services sector in general, 29% of women in the financial services sector dropped out of the workforce temporarily or permanently during the pandemic. And that's because of the increased burden of household responsibility, which often falls onto women. I mean, one statistic I found quite shocking was that at one point in the past 12 months, 1 billion school children were studying from home, and that added an extra 5 hours to the average woman's working day. So that really takes away from work and led to women dropping out of the workforce. And then again, looking at the US and the financial services sector, 2/3 of women in executive or senior management roles said that they would forego compensation for additional flexibility. And that really also affects promotions, because this like showing face in the office really does increase your chance of getting promoted, and flexible workers are often marginalized in this effect.
Yeah, so enormous challenges that need to be addressed, and a huge amount of work to be done to reduce the gap. And perhaps to end, Josie, on an extremely somber note, and an issue that has affected everybody across the world over the last week to 10 days or so, the goings on in Afghanistan and the impact of that for women in that country.
Yeah, so the impact of the Taliban taking over is going to have significant impact on the progress that Afghanistan has made over the past 2 decades in terms of female education, healthcare, just freedom of movement, really. And it's going to set the country back 200 years in terms of achieving gender equality. And there's 18 million girls and women in the country that are now going to be subject to laws from the 7th century, which is really quite frightening.
Yeah, a sad note indeed, and something that needs to be watched very carefully. There are various promises being made, and it'll be interesting to monitor how that situation plays out. But as always, Josie, you have articulated through some research views and a lot of statistics in your recent presentation and on this podcast. There is a huge amount of work to be done. There are a number of issues that have to be addressed in order to overcome this staggering and, to quote you, over the last year, widening gender gap in the workplace. Always good to get your views and the product of your extensive research as part of the Skybound Capital team on a daily basis. As always, you can download the podcast on Apple, Spotify, and the Google Podcast platform for Android. All our podcasts are available at www.skyboundcapital.com on our website. Until next time on Under the Microscope, have a great week.